I'll begin with the testimony from Ms. Laura Cortez, Co-Executive Director, ECR Communities for Environmental Justice. Ms. Cortez, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chair Grijalva and House Committee on Natural Resources. My name is Laura Jazmin Cortez. I live on unceded Tongva land in Southeast Los Angeles. I am a member organizer and co-executive director with East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice. East Yard works in communities that are overburdened with direct and indirect sources of pollution, from Long Beach to the east side of Los Angeles. And as a community, we work to address soil, air, and water quality. At the intersection of these types of pollution is environmental racism. The Environmental Justice for All Act is both a concrete commitment to the communities that have been harmed and a symbolic sign of respect to communities on the ground doing the work and the committee that put this language together. I will next highlight some of the work our communities are doing in relation to the EJ for All Act that passing this policy would uplift and support. In relation to cumulative impacts, there is no single evil villain polluter in EJ communities. What I see as one of the largest issues is that municipalities and agencies currently treat polluters on a case-by-case basis without assessing cumulative impacts. I grew up next to railroad tracks with trains passing at 3 in the morning. I have always lived within 5 minutes of a refinery and a block away from warehouses. I attended elementary school next to the 710 freeway, which sees 40 to 60,000 truck trips daily. My high school track is immediately next to train tracks. My reality is not an exception. And honestly, community is exposed to so much more at the same time, all the time. These issues in land use and health impacts can be reduced through the creation of effective permitting processes. In relation to outdoor access for all, in a high-density area such as California and Los Angeles specifically, the only spaces that are undeveloped are brownfields. This is why we do work nationally with the Moving Forward Network and locally through the Brownfields to Health Fields work. There's opportunity for policy to create green spaces through investment in the cleanup of these contaminated sites and through community-based processes. And one example of that is Maywood Riverfront Park here in Southeast Los Angeles, a former brownfield that was cleaned and developed as a community open space and is now a thriving social hub. In relation to environmental justice grants programs, federal funding for research in our communities is needed. We have seen research in our communities lead to discoveries that challenge agencies and health thresholds through East Yard's Marina Pando Social Justice Research Collaborative. We have studied through this program lead soil contamination, toxic runoff into the LA River, and more. These studies are done by community members using academic methodology to study the environmental justice issues that our community lacks responses to. The outcomes of these studies are then shared through community events that make sure research is done by our hoods for our hoods. In relation to NEPA, as it has been interpreted in my home of California through CEQA, allows for public participation through an environmental impact report process. In our communities, EIRs are often waived through negative declarations. When EIRs are completed because of many community requests, they do not accurately account for traffic bottlenecks, idling, housing in proximity to polluters, housing affordability, and green space. In fair and just transition, labor in my community looks like folks working at the ports as truck drivers in refineries, waste facilities, and rendering plants, then coming home to more contaminated soil, air, and water. Therefore, environmental justice will always be linked to labor and a need to protect the health of workers who are also our parents, uncles, sisters, children, and ensuring that they have stable careers. EJ for All proposes Federal Energy Transition Economic Development Assistance Fund that is needed to ensure a just transition in which workers suffering the health impacts of the oil and gas industry can develop the skills to work in healthier systems that we are working towards. Currently, workers feel like they have to choose between their health and income, but that should not be the case. Finally, we are full of solutions. We have the answers. We have been doing this work. Being an EJ community carries a heavy burden and responsibility to fight for ourselves and each other or die slowly. That is not an exaggeration. Passing EJ for All is that serious. Passing any policy that protects human health without giving loopholes to industry is that important. It's life and death. And we must acknowledge that countless EJ community leaders have worked on these types of solutions, and many of them are no longer with us. And now we have this policy as an opportunity to take EJ seriously. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To Ms. Laura Cortez, I'm close to East LA, but can you speak more to the drinking water studies that your organization has led with members of the community?
With our community, one of the big issues or things that I've learned with water quality, because I'm also a community member who was completely unaware of some of the water issues happening in our hoods. And so education is a big, big issue, starting with the idea of understanding where your water comes from, how water is exploited from other areas and taken. A lot of times those are indigenous communities whose water we are taking. So those are things that we learn together, and then understanding our water reports in terms of our water quality. So water reports, unsure if any of y'all look at your water reports, but they're very technical, very complex, and that's something that we learn as a community want to understand the pollutants, the thresholds, how our notice is given. Every city, every water company is completely different, which creates a lot of complication in terms of being able to understand when there are issues and therefore advocate for improved water quality. How can we advocate for something that the system is created so we do not understand it? And so with that, we've been able to make collaborations with universities to be able to take community members to understand the process of what contaminants are in water, how they have health impacts, how we can start advocating to that. Is that the jurisdiction of a water company? Is that the jurisdiction that is a regional municipality, right? So we need to understand these different agencies, these different pollutants, these different health impacts. And so that's something that we continue to work on with our community members from East LA down. We recently, I know there was a recent policy that passed on PFAS, right? Looking at some of our contaminants there, but there are so many, including lead, including mercury, including nickel, that are in our water that we need to continue to address.
One of the things that you've heard at the hearing and we hear all the time is that we hear that refrain that stronger environmental protections for all communities are going to kill jobs, they're going to inflict economic harm. Uh, is that a choice we have? The choice being economic prosperity uh, and continuing to burden EJ communities with higher share of our nation's pollution and the damaging public health effects by that. How do you respond to that refrain?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is really narrow-minded to really think about jobs only, particularly when we are working those jobs also, right? So it's really important to note that in my community, as an example, we have folks who are truck drivers, who are port workers, who do work in these refineries, who are our families and our neighbors who are having the health issues, but are having, and most of them understand that, right? But risk that because of a job, right? And in talking to these folks, it is very clearly understood that if there was an alternative, that we would love to transition to that alternative.
Let me ask a question, and this just may get me in trouble, but let me just think out loud and ask Ms. Cortez and Ms. Khan to please, can you tell me if the commodity water is part of the environmental justice agenda, I guess. Since water over time has been taken, it's a public commodity. It's water, groundwater, it's a public commodity, and yet water continues to be converted into a private commodity. They take water out from the ground and put it in a bottle and sell it to us. So, Ms. Curtis, in as short a time as you can, please give me some ideas of your thoughts. Give me some of your thoughts on this issue.
With water, I think so. For us at Eastern, we definitely are working on water from an education and policy beginning perspective. We fully believe that appropriating water is not sustainable. We cannot continue to steal water. And so it is really important that we learn to conserve water. So some of the things that we're doing is making sure that we're investing education and also support letters and anything else we can do to make sure that we are retaining as much water that we can from different sources, including like rainwater. We have a big project actually that's less than a block from my house. That's like a 100,000 gallon, huge gallon situation under a park to conserve water. And so these are the types of efforts that we know that we need to be able to not focus on stealing water from other areas, which
All
is
right, thank you.
So I had a question for you. So in your testimony, you called the effects of the pollution in your community environmental racism. And we just heard Mayor Brower talk about the disastrous impacts that denying that community the ability to profit from the resources adjacent to their community would have on things like their drinking water and their health care. And of course, I mean, the mayor represents one of the most marginalized communities in the country. How would denying them the ability to do that not also be environmental racism?
Thank you for that question, because I think I don't know too much about Alaska, but in hearing a lot of how investing in fossil fuels, right, is a leading driver of our economy, is a similar issue of what we have here in Los Angeles. We are an urban economy. We are driven by these fossil fuel like investments, right? And for us, it is very marked, and we stand very firmly that this is not sustainable. It doesn't matter if you can extract these fossil fuels. It doesn't matter if we can get jobs off of them, if we're going to die, if my lungs are being actively impacted daily. And so it doesn't matter. Like at the end of the day, yes, does money matter? Yes, we live in a capitalist society. I understand that. We are not foolish to think that this is an overnight response. What's important to know is that we need investments now to transition to alternative jobs, to alternative energy sources that can then, so that Alaska, Los Angeles, and across the nation, we don't have to rely on these things. And that starts through federal policy. That starts through federal investment.
So my first question is to Ms. Cortez. I'm so, and over the years, been very impressed and grateful for the leadership of East Yard communities for environmental justice. But I'd like you, who've been out there in the field, on the streets, to tell me more about the environmental injustice that my community suffers on the west side of Long Beach. Can you talk more about the very specifics that people who grow up near the port, near the 710 freeway, like yourself, what's that experience like?
I appreciate that question because it allows folks to visualize, right, what we may or may not see. I think it's really important to note that specifically also Long Beach is huge, but specifically the west side of Long Beach is actually divided. It's on the other side of the 710 freeway. And that is a marker, right? Folks here, the other side of the train tracks. These are things that are systemic, but that have huge impacts in terms of place, relations to pollution, and race, right? And I understand folks not wanting to bring race into this conversation, but folks who live in the west side of Long Beach, It's not the same demographic that lives in East Long Beach. It's not the same demographic that lives in other areas. And so with West Long Beach, it is primarily immigrant. It is primarily Black, Indigenous people of color. These folks, there are a range of folks. There are also white folks there, right? But a majority of folks are Black, Indigenous people of color. In West Side specifically, we have a small terminus freeway that is specifically created for trucks. There is the 710 freeway, which I mentioned sees 40 to 60,000 truck trips daily, because it is very close to the port complex, which is a port complex that sees 40% of all goods that come into this country come through those ports, right? Up the 710 freeway to get to the rail yards. There's also right now a proposed new rail yard development, a new intermodal facility being proposed right next to West Long Beach. And so it's really important to look at, these are the cumulative impacts that we're talking about, that that are not being addressed in any policy right now, but that could be addressed with this new policy.
That. So if you could describe to me a bit why you think it's important that your community, as organized as you become, has the tools that you need, that this bill gives you, so that you can protect your ability to thrive and to live in this environment that is cleaner than what you do now.
Thank you. And I'll make it really quick that the reality is that we already have so much education and tools that we've already implemented locally, that we've already implemented regionally. And either we have succeeded and have proven it, either we have failed and learned and gone back and done it, or we have realized that agencies, municipalities, state legislation is not going to move until the federal government can set an example by passing policies like EJ for All to, one, invest by giving us the tools to be able to do this work, or pass policy that shows them that we are just as important and that they should also pass these more local, more smaller policies with us.
I want to just turn very quickly to Dr. Sheets, to Ms. Cortez, and others here to say, can you please just reiterate, we've been talking about this all morning, but why is it so important that our communities have a seat at the table?
I think for us, we have nothing to lose. Literally, like, this is our lives and we will continue fighting for it. And this policy and any policy that is truly focused on EJ, we will continue fighting for it, and we will continue fighting for a seat at this table.
Because of that, in your experience, do oil and gas companies deliberately pick low income and frontline communities for their facilities?
Yes, this is Laura.
Yeah.
Like,
Why, Ms. Cortez?
because the processes are so complex, it doesn't these companies are able to come into our communities with things like an EIR, a negative declaration, in which community members who are already struggling to make ends meet, are working two jobs, can't find childcare, are having health impacts, are having to go to the emergency room, are not able to fully participate in challenging these projects. A lot of times, like I said, there's even a negative declaration, so it doesn't even undergo a process, which allows for the continued systemic placing of these facilities near our homes.
And my understanding is that the Environmental Justice for All Act, one of the ways it would address that is to permit, it would amend the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to prohibit discrimination based on disparate impact. And it would effectively allow these low-income communities, when they are harmed and it's disproportionate to them, to be able to raise discrimination claims on that basis. Are companies right now currently cleaning up their pollution in these communities, Ms. Cortez?
They are not. So many of them are allowed to leave. A lot of them just abandon ship, and these are what we now call brownfields in our communities. And because Los Angeles is such an urban area, what we see is that the only sites that are open, that there's nothing developed on, is because they are brownfields that continue to pollute our communities through gas emissions.
Ms. Cortez, we passed $21 billion for environmental remediation in the Build Back Better infrastructure package. What do you think would be one or two areas of focus that we should work on to remediate past environmental justice issues?
think remediation of brownfields, as I was mentioning earlier, is super important because these areas are toxic. A lot of these areas are dirt, they're uncovered. Some of us, if we don't know how to find the tools, we don't even know what toxics we're being exposed to, but a lot of them are adjacent to homes. We've seen that happen here where brownfields or active polluting sites have caused numerous metal type of cancers where folks are actively dying even after the facility is shut down.
Ms. Cortez, I know you've already spoke extensively on the importance of brownfields, but can you speak more to the work you do to revitalize brownfields locally and the opportunity we have in these areas to provide healthy outdoor recreation spaces and environmental amenities and environmental justice communities that lack access to such amenities now?
Thank you. I think similar to what you mentioned in Lowell, and I'm sure in other areas as well, our communities, most of the brownfields that I know of were either paint manufacturers, metal manufacturers, chrome platers, and landfills. Um, and so as they leave, right, they leave this behind and leave behind the compound gases, metals on the floor, and other such things that continue to harm the community. One of the big issues and why funding is so important is because what's happening is that private developers purchase these brownfields and they want to turn over their profit, right? And so what happens is that the only thing that can be redeveloped and because when you redevelop you have to clean, right? So these developers end up doing a cleanup, but because they have to pay for the cleanup, they make sure that they have a business that is going to yield them a significant amount of profit. And so what we see is that they get cleaned up to put other polluters there. That is literally what we see is they're cleaning up to put more polluters there, and that does not allow for green spaces. And so federal funding that has already come through our hoods is super important to allow for green spaces that we so desperately need to be created. And in addition to that, these sites are so big that what we see is right now in our urban neighborhoods, all we have access to is pocket parks. That's a great start. That is not enough. That is not enough for substantial recreation. And so these types of investments into brownfields are very important.
Yeah, if you could just like bring it home for us. I mean, how will the Environmental Justice for All Act help support the more equitable access to parks and recreational opportunities for these underserved and economically disadvantaged communities?
EJ for All will be able to provide funding so that we can have these spaces cleaned and have green spaces accessible to the communities that are most impacted and do not have access currently to these types of facilities.
Thank you so much for that and for all the work that you do.